Okay, so hey guys, how we doing? I hope y'all are having a great day so far, and welcome to another webinar organized by 99X. A bit about me. My name is Heshan Vikramaratne. I'm a trainee software engineer here and a third year software engineering undergraduate at UCLan UCL. I work full stack while also doing a bit of 3D modeling, rigging, animation, character designing, and of course, a bit of creative coding as a hobby. So just to quickly go through the outline for today, we'll be taking a small introduction as to what creative coding is as a concept, different frameworks and tools that can be used for creative coding. Uh, we'll also be going through p5.js, which is a very popular JavaScript library for creative coding, ML5 with p5, integrating p5 with different stuff like React and other web application development, followed by a Q&A session. So you guys can just fire away questions that you have, even during the session that we are going through. It doesn't have to be towards the end. You can just put it in the chat and I'll be answering them at the end of this session. All right, so let's begin. So first things first, what is creative coding? So it's also known as generative art, as some of you might have heard of it. So it has a lot of definitions. So before this webinar, I did a bit of research, and you can, if you just Google it, you'll find a lot of definitions to it because it's an expressive form. So, but if you summarize most of them, you can come up to a definition such as it's a concept where you use a programming language to code and generate art. It's to visualize something, to create something expressive rather than something functional. So when you're developing something, we always tend to create something functional. Maybe it could be a web application, a mobile application. It doesn't matter, but most of the time it's quite functional. But with creative coding, what we do is we try to create something expressive out of it, uh, sort of like an art. So there are a couple of limitations, I guess. I won't. Okay, so it's not really a limitation as in a technical way, but I guess the limitations, as I see it, is the imagination and a bit of mathematical knowledge. So apart from that, the rest is just about processing limitations when it comes to processing the art. So generative art, it's not a new thing. It's not something that just popped out in the 21st century. It has been there for quite some time now. So as I said, I did a bit of research before this webinar, and during the time that I got into creative coding, it actually dates back to 1960s. So, and another thing is programming has always been a form of art. So if you're a programmer, sometimes the solution that you provide to a problem, it can be very different than to the one that's been uh, provided by your fellow developer or the one colleague in your team. So because of that, programming is always considered as an art, since it's like the signature of an artist. Sometimes when you go through the code of another person in your team, you can just see, or you can just imagine what's done by the other, what's going through his mind, and you can actually sometimes even know who it was developed by without actually knowing it, from the way the code is structured, from the comments, and likewise. So programming, just to highlight again, programming has always been a form of art. So the purpose of creative coding, apart from creating art, of course, is it's used for data visualization. One of its uses is data visualization, actually. And it's also used for stuff like interactive art, integrating with web pages. Like I said before, we'll be looking at how, or we can easily integrate creative coding with web projects like React applications. It's used in robotics, and also it's used in marketing. So these major brands like Adidas, Nike, Dolby, they actually use creative coding to generate art for marketing purposes. And also it's a profession. So if you come to think of it, I've added a link here. So this is one of the people that I've seen who do creative coding as a profession, and this is a portfolio by one of them. So let me. Right. So as you can see, it's a profession as well, creative coding. So I'm doing development. This is, as I said, this is a hobby for me. But if someone is interested in it, it is actually a profession that someone can get into. So it's, I think since it takes, okay, so, all right, so sorry about that. It was loading a bit slow. I guess there's a network issue from my end, a small network issue. Sorry about that. So going back to the presentation, let's move on to JavaScript. So JavaScript is one of the most popular languages for creative coding as of now. It's that because of a couple of reasons. First of all, it's really easy to learn. It doesn't matter whether you are coming from a programming background or just someone, a traditional artist who might be getting into creative coding. It's JavaScript is really easy to learn as a beginner. So that's one of the key reasons why JavaScript is very popular for this. And also the other major reason is that you can use a JavaScript to creative code in the browser. So you can have integrated with different web applications and stuff, easily doing it in the easily coding it in the browser without actually setting up massive development environments. So those are the two key reasons for JavaScript being this popular for creative coding. Now, JavaScript is not the only language, and the P5 is not the only framework that is available out there. There are a lot. So there are stuff like Cinder with C++, Generative Pi with Python, Max MSP, which is a popular tool for creating audio, creating tunes, like creative coding, not just for art, but also to create different types of music like tunes. So Max MSP is something like that, and there are many more like this. These are just a few of them. Which brings me to P5. So P5.js is a JavaScript library, like I said earlier. It's not just a JavaScript library, but it is one of the most popular JavaScript libraries out there for creative coding. So there are a couple of reasons for that. One of them is it's a very complete library. Now, when I say that it's a very complete library, you might, if you're really starting with P5, sometimes you may have this idea in your head, design that you want to code, but when you start with P5, you might feel like it doesn't provide all the necessary functions that you need, like the math functions and stuff, but it actually does. It just takes a bit of knowing what P5 is and just trying out stuff with it. It takes a bit of time, so there's like a slight learning curve. It's not a massive one like learning a different programming language altogether, or like learning mobile development. It's not like that. It has a learning curve, but it's not a massive one. As I said, it takes a bit of imagination and some maths knowledge really helps with it. The second reason it's popular is it has a lot of math functions that you can use. Math plays a massive role in creative coding, especially if you want to create really expressive stuff. It doesn't have to be math functions as in like major physics stuff, but still a general knowledge on sine, cos, tan, and vectors really do come in creating really expressive creative code, really expressive creative art. So the third reason is it it has a massive community. Since the start of P5JS, it has only been the community has only been growing. So because of that, it has a massive community. So if you start working with P5 and you get stuck somewhere, or you need inspiration, or like something like just inspiration, maybe if you want to start somewhere, it does provide it has a massive community that you can reach out to. And also from their side, uh, it it is a very they provide a really comprehensive documentation. So they have examples of different projects done by different people from the P5 community. And also this reference is the documentation with a lot of helpful, it's categorized in a nice way, so it's easy to get around, and it provides a very comprehensive documentation. So with P5, what we do is when we code out, we use the canvas element. It's a HTML element that we rarely use. Sometimes it's for creating 2D and 3D graphics, but we rarely use it, since just using the HTML canvas and vanilla.js is not always ideal. What I mean by not always ideal is it's a bit difficult to draw complex art. Now, if you're just drawing something like a circle, which is really unlikely when it comes to creative coding, um, but when you if you use just vanilla.js and the canvas, it's not something that you can't do, but it will take massive lines of code and just to get something to appear in the browser. So P5 just provides a framework that utilizes the canvas and gives you a nice interface where you can work with it. So another reason for creative coding is to have randomness. So this is a key difference between traditional and generative art. So I just added a small project that I did. So these two images, it looks similar, right? But it's not, since the second one is completely different than to the one that you see in the left. The right one is completely different than to the one that you see on the left. So this is randomness. If you're a traditional artist, you might say, as an example, take the first picture. So you draw this first picture. Obviously, you can draw it, right? It's just squares and circles. But if you do draw it as a traditional art, it's just that. So you have this art and you're done with it, and that's it. But what if you feel like this is not the sort of output that you needed? This is not the art that you had in mind. You need it to be something different, but still something very alike to the first one that you got. So that's where the randomness comes in. With creative coding, you will have the of uh, freedom to code something that gives you art that is something that you had in your mind. So as I said, these two are very similar, but will still give you the option to tweak it a bit with just an interaction, such as pressing a key in the keyboard, or just a mouse click, something like that. So with just one single interaction, you will be able to change the art that you initially had into something completely different. So a bit about P5 basics. It's, as I said, it's not a very difficult thing to learn. It provides really basic functions, such as these two functions that you see on the top, the setup and the draw function. They are major functions. The one that you see below is an event listener, which is which I'll be coming back to a bit later. But if you concentrate on the first two functions, they are the most important ones. So if you're a bit familiar with games concepts, these two functions act very similar to that. So the setup function is something that gets run once when you execute the program. this setup function runs once. So if you are declaring variables or like things that you want to happen just once, you'll be having them in the setup function. The draw function is where all the frames are drawn. So this is in fact a loop. So that's what you'll be using to animate. It's just like the main game loop and the setup function that you have when you develop games. So it's a bit similar to that. So let me go to an example here. So, okay. Okay, so the first square, the art that I showed earlier. So if you take a look at that first function right there, I hope you guys can see it. Yes. So this is the art that you saw a while back in the slides. So as I said, you have the setup function, the draw function. So those are the two main functions that you have when you're working with creative coding. And then all the other functions, they work as just vanilla JS stuff. You can even use arrow functions, it doesn't matter. But these two functions, they play a major role. Uh, this is just a boilerplate p5.js project that I have here. So in the index file, I have the scripts attached to it. And the sketch is where I do the drawing. So as I said, when it comes to randomness, you can have just that when you use creative coding. So say that this is kind of the design that you had in mind, but you need it to be something a bit different. So what I've done here is I've added this two functions called loop and no loop when mouse pressed and mouse released. These are functions provided by P5. So with just a click of the mouse, I can change this to a completely different design. So that's one of the best reasons for having for creative coding, to have endless amount of different variations of the same design. So that's just one of them. So with just one single click, I can change this to a complete different design than to the one that was there before. And if we need to change the number of stuff that we have here, we can even do that. So if I save this, now I have just a grid with 5 squares. And if I want to increase this to 20, then I would have a grid with 20 squares. Or if it is just one, it's just if it is just two, you have a grid with two columns. So that is using randomness and having like a really having an optimized code with the functionality to tweak the design. So if we look at another sketch that I have here, so this is something that I did to recreate the React symbol. So what this does is it uses a bit of math. So the one that you saw earlier, it uses randomness, but it doesn't use a lot of math. So in this example, I'm using a bit of math. It's not a lot, but I'm using sine here. So I have this class where, of course, I'm using a class to create an atom for this. So I create a class, and from that, I use a bit of math to have this the rotation that I need. So I use cos for the x movement and sine for the y movement, and I use the frame count and then a bit of transparency behind it. So this animation that you see from the behind, it's actually just 3 dots moving with the background having a transparent slight reduced opacity to it. So it looks like it's creating this path. Actually, it's just one object, one ellipse, actually just one ellipse per path that's moving in, but the effect is created by a slightly transparent background. So it doesn't use a lot of math, but still uses sine and cos, and of course pi to change the rotation just to adapt it to the way that I want. Now, if we look at classes, as I said, in JS, we rarely use classes now. Now, I've been doing a bit of React development for the past couple of months, and we never really use JavaScript classes. Since you can easily create an object out of it, so JavaScript supports that function, so you never really use a lot of classes unless it's something that's specified with it. So this is something that I created just to demonstrate the use of classes, JavaScript classes. So what this example does is it takes the mouse wheel as an event, and when I scroll it, it creates objects. These firework objects. This firework is a class that I created. So when I scroll it, it just adds them to an array, a fireworks array, and it displays them. It displays them using this fly function another function that I have inside the class. I'm not going to go too much into detail of how the code works. I'm just explaining different stuff that you can do with P5. So this is all this stuff, it's done with P5 with minimum maths. So this uses JavaScript classes, and all the gravity, the directions and stuff, they are manipulated as variables. So when I mean variables, I'm saying that I'm not using vectors so far. So vectors, as I said, it plays a massive role in creative coding. So what I'm saying is we can improve this code using vectors. I will come back to vectors in a bit, or just saying that this is something that's done without using most of the math functions provided by P5. And so as I said, this is another function that I created just so this is about optimizing arrays. So when you use P5, since you are rendering this stuff in the browser, optimizing the code really does matter. So if you have a lot of functionality in the code, and if you have a lot of loops and loops, nested loops and stuff, it could really slow it down. And so you must try to optimize the code as much as possible. That means if it's just to create an art and to just render it out and have it as a video or something, or just PNGs, then it really doesn't matter as long as the browser renders it little by little. But if you're integrating P5 with different stuff like web applications, you do need to think about the optimization of how this would affect the overall app. So one thing that you can do with arrays and randomness, now as I said, randomness plays a massive role with P5. Using randomness can also mean you're complicating the code. So what I have here is it uses so it starts with binary values, and then it creates the string that I pass in here. So there are different ways of doing it. The way that I've done here is I use random values, and once one value of, like, say the first one that's created, if it is h, if this character is taken from the random value and then it's not a random value anymore, then I remove it from the array. So that is array.pop. So like that, if you're using arrays, and if those arrays are massive ones, these arrays have big lengths, it's always better to pop, like push and pop, and have these, since this is taken in frames. When you're drawing it, it's in frames. If you have a array with 500 elements, it would display these 500 elements each frame. So it's very, very complex. It slows down the rendering, and it slows down the app. So one thing that you can do for that is, once you're done with the array, once you're done with the stuff that you want to do with the array, just remove the stuff that you have inside it if you don't want it after that. So that is what I'm doing here. If you don't do that, this would take a lot of computational power when you do this. So as I said, before I come into the vectors, if you can remember the fireworks example that I showed earlier, as I said, it could be made better. So that is using vectors. So what you saw earlier, I wasn't using any vectors. I had different constants and variables defined for X and Y positions, and I'm using them. So a vector has a direction and a magnitude. So because of this, it provides a better way of creating stuff like creating physics. So for acceleration, deacceleration, gravity, wind, stuff like that. So for coding those into your project, vectors really do help. So from vectors, P5 supports vectors. It has its built-in function called create vector, which you can create it for each shape that you have in your project. And then you can manipulate the magnitude, and you can add different vectors to it, and you can do vector mathematics on it to have an entirely different vector that goes in some direction that you want. So that's using vectors. So if I go to a example here, let me open the example. Okay, so this is something that I created with vectors. So I defined the angle mode as degrees. These are just basic functions from P5. And I have a class again, as I said, an ellipse class that has a setter function for setting the middle, then updating and showing the stuff. So what I have here is I can create different ellipses, and after a bit, they will always come to the middle of the screen, regardless of where it was spawned. So recreating this without vectors would take more lines of code than I have here. So this is just done with a few lines of code, But if we actually did this without vectors, without using vectors and vector mathematics, this would take more lines of code. It just doesn't make sense to create something like this without vectors. So just highlighting here, P5 does support vectors that you can use. And with the vectors, you can do vector mathematics. So I'm setting the magnitude here as 5, and I'm limiting the acceleration, then adding a velocity to it, then normalizing it so that it always outputs one value, and then multiplying it by 5. And then the final vector is added to the position. So that is what creates this art right here. And as I said, using vectors, it gives you more freedom to toy with the code, to have different outputs of the same project that you have here. So if I change the magnitude to 10, and let me save it, it gives a different value. So it's slightly similar to the one that you had, but it's still different. Or if I give it the same value as the acceleration, it's again slightly different than to the one that you had earlier. And if you add a bit more acceleration to it, then that is also different. So that this is something that was created with the different acceleration. So as I said, it gives you more freedom over changing your codes, changing the art that you're doing. So going back, the next thing is P5 does support WebGL. So if you're if you might be familiar with WebGL, it's a JavaScript API for 2D and 3D graphics. So all you have to do is just pass in a third parameter called WebGL when you create the canvas element. So let me open that one, this sketch. This is passing the third parameter for WebGL, and this is what you see. Since this is streamed, it has a slight delay from my end as well from the internet, and since a lot of stuff are happening right now with the browsers, the live streaming and everything, it's a bit laggy. So that's the lag that you see here. Even so you can control the 3D art that you have using the same event handlers that you saw earlier. So what I'm doing here is just using the mouse scroll to change different values in this code. So okay, so another thing that you can do with P5 is to integrate it with ML5. So ML5 is a machine learning library. It's a it's a so as they say, it's a very friendly machine learning library, especially if you're not coming from a programming background and if you don't have a lot of knowledge on different machine learning stuff. This just provides a framework that artists can use. So it uses TensorFlow behind the scenes. I'm not going to render the one that I created for this project, since even without the ML stuff, this is taking a bit of time to render. So what I'll do is I did create a small video out of it, what you can do with ML5. So this is something that I did with ML5. So you can have the code as you want, and then this is just recognizing key points of the face and then just outputting them as binary values with a binary background. So this is something that I did just to show you guys what you can do with ML5. So going back, as I said, you can integrate P5 with stuff like React, and it doesn't take a lot. I'm really saying it because there are a lot of libraries out there and different frameworks created by people. So by far, React P5 is one of the best that I've seen here. So React P5, it doesn't take any additional, you don't have to go through additional documentations and stuff. You can do the creative coding project as a separate file, and then to your React application, you can just take that set of folders, and then you can reference the canvas with this library. So one thing to keep in mind when you are integrating P5 with React is to not use states and use effects inside the P5 project, not the React one, but inside the P5 project. So when you actually render it, it doesn't mess up the application, since states and use effects, it causes the app to re-render even without P5. So with P5 integrated and then with React, then React states and use effects, it can really give you outputs that you really don't want. So that's one thing to highlight. And the next thing is, as I said, just to show you guys, I did integrate the name that I had into a React project that I have. So this is hosted with GitHub pages. So as you can see here, this is indeed a React app. So this is the splash screen in it. And I can just go to a different screen. Just think of this as a splash screen, then move on to a different page after a while. You can do anything you want with it after you integrate it with React. Now, one thing to keep in mind is the states. As I said earlier, don't use states and use effects inside the P5 if you're integrating it with React. So just just as some tips from personal experience, use randomness as much as you can when you create art, since that's one of the key reasons for using creative code, using approaches like creative coding, because you can't have that much variations and randomness when it comes to traditional art. And another thing is, uh, if you're integrating it with different platforms, too much P5 can be really bad. Uh, Most of the projects that I showed you now, the examples, they are just basic P5 projects. They are not integrated with anything. Especially if you have WebGL stuff and if you have a lot of logic behind the scenes with the P5 project, if you integrate it with a web application like a React application, maybe it can cause the app to slow down and give this really nasty error that sometimes guys might have noticed, that says this web page is slowing down the browser, like that. So if you do integrate with React, be mindful of states. As I said earlier, states causes the app to re-render, and that could really get in the way of the frames when inside the draw function, as I said earlier. Avoid too many loops. When you create a P5 project, try to don't have a lot of loops. And if you want something to, if you had different functions that you need to do inside loops, just try to use the loops that you already have. And if you're nesting them, try to keep it to just two loops, like just one loop nested inside another. Don't go beyond that, since that logic is going to be executed every time it draws a frame. And if you use JavaScript classes and objects to make the code cleaner, as I said, you can use JavaScript classes when you do your P5 project. So it makes the code cleaner, and it makes your life way easier when you code art. And you can also use VS Code extensions. So most of the stuff that you saw me doing now, they were through a live server extension that I use, as you can see here. So that's an extension that I use. It's called a live server. So with this, you don't have to create your own server, just all the backend stuff that you need to do. You don't have to do them. You can have a live server extension, and with just one click, you can go live, and then you can edit it in real time. So when you click Control S, it will update in the browser, and it will make your life easier when you do your creative coding project. And one last thing is the browser does matter. Uh, so different browsers are optimized in different ways. So if you're working on Windows, if you're creating your project in Windows, Edge is much better on Windows than Firefox. So what I'm saying is that I'll just show it in an example. So let me just close this, and I'm going to run this sample sketch that I have here. So this one. So this is, as you can see, it's really slow when you render it in Firefox. But if you, there's a small lag from my side. Okay, so if you do render it in Edge, this is the result if you render it in Edge. As you can see, it's much faster than the one that you saw from Firefox. So when you're doing your creative coding project, the browser does matter. So keep that in mind. Yeah, so that brings me to the end of the presentation. If you guys have any questions, um, you can send it in the chat, and I will do my best to answer them. All right, fire away. All right, so we have one question so far. So that is, can we use ML Kit from Firebase? Uh, as I said, with P5, you're just having the script. You just attach the script to the index, and then you're using the functions that you have with it. So just like that, you can use any other libraries that you have, or like it really doesn't matter as long as you have an idea or design idea in your head. And when you start doing it, you can just integrate anything you want, such as if you want to, as I showed earlier, if you want to just integrate it as a React project, then you can do that. Or if you want to have a bit of machine learning aspects into it, you can use ML5. But one of the reasons for using ML5 is not just because it's easy to use, but it is also because it's lightweight than using other libraries. Because it's lightweight, as in it's developed mainly for the purpose of using in the browser. And it says that in this large text when you just go to the website saying friendly machine learning for the web. So that's one reason for me using ML5 instead of using others, since ML5 also uses TensorFlow behind the scenes. Okay, so we have another question. Is it better to use OOP or procedural for optimization? So well, when you're using OOP, like I said, it's not necessary OOP, right? Since uh, in the most of the examples that I showed earlier, I was just using the class to create objects. So that's the encapsulation is there, but it's not 100% object oriented, since we are just utilizing the class for creating our own class and then just creating instances out of it. Uh, when it comes to optimization, it's mainly it's done with your logic. As I said, if you have a lot of loops inside the draw function, since the draw function, it repeatedly executes in each frame. So if you have a lot of heavyweight logic in your draw function, it could slow down the application. And if you're using a lot of 2D arrays, then also arrays of objects, like I did earlier. So in most of these examples, I've limited them, the number of stuff, because if I just kept on creating those ellipses or just the fireworks, then at a given time, it would just uh, slow down the browser. So in terms of optimization, if you're using object orientation to create an object, which has a constructor, and inside the constructor you have a lot of variables in it. You initialize an object with a lot of variables, for maybe it's for position, acceleration, or gravity. It doesn't matter. But if you are using object orientation and you're creating objects out of it, just try to have a limit, like have a condition in the application that says, if you have so in the examples that I had earlier, I I have an array and I push these new objects into that array when the mouse is clicked. So one optimization that you can do is you can have a limit to it. You can have say you can only push up to 20 objects. So you have the length, you check for the length, and then you have only 20 objects. Another approach that I usually do is I give it a timeout sometimes. So once the objects are in the final position, like in the vectors example that I showed, you just spawn ellipses in different places, and then it comes to the middle, and then it start to rotate. So when it start to rotate, yeah, you can't really see the number of ellipses you have there. So what I do is I can have a timeout function, and then just pop some of the objects out of that array, so that it's better optimized. It doesn't really slow down the browser. Okay, so seems like we don't have any more questions. So I want to take this time to thank you all for joining. Uh, yeah, thank you guys for joining to this webinar, and uh, subscribe to the our 99x YouTube channel for more webinars like this, more interesting topics. So stay tuned. Thank you for joining one last time. See you guys.